He didn't lock her in a storage closet or a concrete cell. He gave her the Penthouse guest suite, 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, an espresso machine that probably cost more than her car, and a deadbolt that engaged from the outside with a sound like a gunshot cracking in a quiet room. Luca Solano had expected the confinement to do its work. He'd seen men far bigger than Piper Hale unravel in far less comfortable circumstances. He expected tears. He expected the desperate, clawing kind of fear that made people useful, made them say things they'd never say otherwise. What he didn't expect was Piper sitting cross-legged on the king-sized bed at 11:30 that first night, eating complimentary dark chocolate from the minibar and annotating, in small, precise red ink, the financial prospectus she'd been auditing when his men intercepted her outside the Meridian Group's offices. His financial prospectus. The one that should have been locked in a level 5 encrypted server. She'd had it printed, in her bag, because she liked to work with paper. The irony wasn't lost on him. Piper heard his footsteps slow outside the door on the second evening. She didn't look up. She was used to men pausing when they didn't know what to do with her. The lock clicked. Solano stepped into the suite. He was taller in person than she'd imagined from 3 months of only ever seeing his signature on wire transfer authorizations. He wore a dark charcoal suit, no tie, collar open at the throat. A fresh cut ran along his left jaw. His eyes went to the papers first, then to her face, then back to the papers. She watched him process the situation. "Comfortable?" he asked. His voice was low and measured, the kind that didn't need volume to carry weight. "The espresso machine is excellent," Piper said, still not looking up. "The blackout curtains stick on the left side, and whoever handles your accounts receivable for the Lakeshore import shell hasn't reconciled the Q3 carry forward in 2 years." She turned a page. "It's going to create a $40,000 discrepancy when the IRS runs the variance check next spring. You're welcome to that information, Mr. Solano. No charge." Silence. She finally looked up. He was staring at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't recognize. "You're auditing my books," he said, "not a question." "I was hired to audit your books," Piper said evenly. "The fact that I'm currently doing it from your guest room instead of an office park in Oak Brook doesn't change the math." Something moved through his expression, not anger, not exactly, more like recalibration. He had come into this room with a clear script. She had apparently not received a copy. "You were going to go to the FBI," Solano said, pulling the door closed behind him. He didn't advance into the room. He stayed near the threshold, like he was keeping an exit close, though Piper noticed he didn't seem like a man who needed one. He stood the way people stood when they'd been the only thing between order and catastrophe for so long that it had become posture, heavy, deliberate, permanent. "I was going to finish the audit," Piper said. "What I did or didn't do after that depended on what I found." She tilted her head. "You pulled me before I finished." "What had you found?" She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without flinching, without performing, the way powerful men looked when they were genuinely paying attention and had nothing to prove by performing patience. "Enough to know someone in your organization has been routing payments through the Meridian subsidiary for 14 months, Piper said. "About 2.3 million. Whoever it is, they're good. They used round-trip entries across 4 entities to obscure the destination." She paused. "But not good enough. They kept reusing the same 3-day settlement window. That's a timing tell. Sloppy." The muscle in Solano's jaw moved. "You found this in 3 months." "I found this in 6 weeks, she said. "I spent the other 6 weeks making sure I wasn't wrong." He looked at her for a long time in the low light of the suite. She could hear the wind hitting the glass 42 stories up, the river a dark ribbon below. "You should be more afraid," Solano said finally. It wasn't a threat. It sounded almost curious. Piper set the prospectus down on her knee. "Mr. Solano, I grew up in 3 different group homes by the time I was 16. I did my first unofficial accounting work at 14 to keep my house mother from getting defrauded by a contractor. I've been underpaid and underestimated by every person I've ever worked for." She picked up her pen again. "Being locked in a 42-floor penthouse with a functional espresso machine is genuinely not the worst situation I've survived this week. Are you going to let me finish the audit or not?" He left without answering. But he didn't take the prospectus. By the third day, a sealed laptop appeared on the writing desk. No internet access, hardwired to a local encrypted server. Piper treated it like Christmas. She worked for 11 hours straight, barely touching the lunch left outside the door by a compact, expressionless woman named Marta, who never made eye contact and always left food hot. By the time Solano returned that evening, Piper had built a complete financial map of his organization's shell structure across 7 entities, identified the leak with 90% certainty, and written up a 6-page summary in the memo format she used for corporate clients. She handed it to him when he walked in. He stood near the window and read it in silence. She watched him read, watched the stillness in him shift by degrees, the way a building shifts before it settles, internal adjustments no one else would notice. "Auditor," he said quietly. The name came out stripped of anger, flat, like a number that didn't balance. "Your head of compliance," Piper confirmed. "He's been siphoning through the Cayman routing since March of last year. The amounts are calibrated to stay just under internal audit thresholds." She paused. He knew where the thresholds were set. He had to. Solano lowered the memo. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw it clearly, the exhaustion underneath the authority. The particular kind of tired that came not from too much work, but from too many people failing the test. "He's been with me for 9 years, Solano said. "I know," Piper said. "His photo is in the company directory. He came to your opening of the Meridian Group's flagship location. The picture is in the press archive." She hesitated, then said something she hadn't planned to. "That's the part that's actually hard, isn't it? Not the money." Solano looked at her. His jaw was tight, his hands were still. "You don't know anything about my life," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was probably supposed to end conversations. "No," Piper agreed. "But I know what 9 years looks like in a ledger. And I know what betrayal looks like when someone tries to hide it in the rounding." He didn't respond. He pulled the chair from the writing desk and sat down heavily, like his body had made the decision before his mind had time to object. He rubbed a hand across his face, across the cut along his jaw that still hadn't fully closed. They spent the next 2 hours going through the Cayman routing together. Her on the bed with the laptop, him at the desk with a printed copy of her analysis, asking questions she hadn't expected him to know how to ask. He was genuinely good with numbers, fast. He caught implications 3 steps ahead of where most people would have stopped looking. She pointed that out without quite meaning to. "You don't have to sound surprised," he said, not looking up from the printout. "I'm not surprised," Piper said. The people who run organizations like yours usually hire someone to understand the money so they don't have to." "I can't afford not to understand it myself," Solano said quietly. "The moment the money becomes abstract, it becomes a door someone else controls." Piper looked at the side of his face. The lamp on the desk cast shadows under his cheekbone, across the old scar that ran from his ear to the line of his jaw on the right side. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. The room was very quiet. He stood up, picked up his copy of the analysis, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the knob. "Go to sleep, Miss Hale," he said. "You look like you haven't slept since Tuesday." "I work better tired," she said. "That's not something to be proud of." He left, the lock engaged. Piper stared at the door for a moment. Then she lay back against the headboard and listened to the city 42 floors below and thought about the way he'd said the moment the money becomes abstract, it becomes a door someone else controls, like it was something he'd learned the hard way from the wrong end of that door. She didn't sleep for another 2 hours. The night he came back bleeding started the same way the other nights had. Quiet. The building settling, the distant percussion of the city. Then, just past 2 in the morning, the deadbolt slid back without the usual warning of footsteps in the hall. Piper was already sitting up before the door opened. Solano appeared in the frame. No jacket. His white dress shirt was open at the collar, and there was blood, a deep, spreading stain along his right side that had soaked through to the fabric beneath. His hand was pressed flat against his ribs. His face was the color of old chalk. He looked at her, something in his eyes that she had never seen there before. Not weakness exactly, but the absence of performance. "There's a man in the hall," he said, his voice compressed and tight. "He works for Auditor, he's been." His knee went. He caught himself against the door frame, pressing his back to the wood, sliding slowly, until he was sitting on the floor with his legs out in front of him, hand still clamped to his side. Piper was across the room in 3 steps. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Move your hand," she said. "It's—" I said, "Move it." He moved it. The fabric beneath was torn, and the wound underneath was a deep, ugly gash along the lower right ribs, a blade, not a bullet. She could see that immediately, deep and messy and still actively bleeding, but nothing she could identify as immediately fatal if she moved fast. She pulled the hem of her sleep shirt off over her head without hesitating, pressed it hard against the wound, and looked up at him. "Don't," he started. "Stop talking," she said. "Where's your first aid kit?" "Hall bathroom, cabinet under the sink." "Is the man in the hallway still a problem?" A pause. "No." "Anyone else in the penthouse?" "Not anymore." Piper absorbed this information, filed it, kept pressing. "Can you walk if I help you?" "Yes." It took 4 minutes to get him to the bathroom, his arm across her shoulders, her shoulder taking most of his weight as he moved carefully, his breathing shallow and controlled in the deliberate way of someone managing significant pain through concentration alone. He left a dark smear along the wall of the hall that she didn't look at. She got him onto the closed lid of the toilet and went through the cabinet under the sink. The first aid kit was military grade. Of course it was. "This is going to need stitches," she said, laying out what she needed on the edge of the basin. "I'm not a nurse." "I know," he said. His chin had dropped toward his chest. "Neither am I, and I've done it myself twice." A pause that might have been wry if he'd had more breath behind it. "You'll be fine." "Great pep talk," Piper said. She poured antiseptic. His hand shot out and gripped the edge of the countertop, knuckles white. He didn't make a sound. She watched the tendons in his forearm stand out against the skin as he rode the pain without flinching, and she thought, not for the first time that week, about how much energy it must cost to be Luca Solano every hour of every day. "Keep your eyes on my face," she said, picking up the curved needle. "Don't look at this." He lifted his head, his eyes found hers. They stayed there while she worked. She'd learned the technique from a manual when she was 17, a night when one of the older kids in her group home had caught a bad cut, and there was no car, and the nearest urgent care was a 90-minute bus ride. She hadn't done a good job then. She did a better one now. "You're not what I expected," Solano said, quiet and slightly distant with blood loss, while she tied off the 4th knot. "What did you expect?" Piper said. She already knew the answer. Young woman, freelance auditor, no family, no connections, no real leverage. Someone who would break into tears when the door locked and be manageable by morning. "Someone easier to read," he said. She cut the thread, pressed gauze over the wound and taped it down, her hands steadier than she'd expected. "I spent a long time being easy to read," she said, without quite deciding to. "It didn't get me anything except overlooked." Solano said nothing. She stood up, took a clean towel from the rack, and turned back to him. She cleaned the dried blood from his hands, his forearms, a smear across his collarbone. He sat still through it the way exhausted people sit through things they've stopped arguing with. "Your phone," she said. "Give it to me." He looked at her. Then he reached into his trouser pocket, slowly face tightening with the movement, and placed it in her hand. "Gavril," he said, "second contact. He runs East Side operations." "I can figure out who's vetted," Piper said. "Who's reliable?" The corner of Solano's mouth moved, almost a smile. "Gavril." She put the call on speaker and set the phone on the edge of the sink. It rang twice, a man's voice graveled and alert despite the hour. "Boss." "Mr. Gavril," Piper said, "this is Piper Hale. I'm the auditor currently in the Penthouse. Mr. Solano is indisposed. Knife wound, not making calls tonight. Listen carefully." She paused to let that land. "Auditor is the leak. He had a contact here tonight, and that contact is no longer a problem. But Auditor knows this location, and he knows Mr. Solano is compromised. I need you to bring your two most trusted people to the service entrance on Wacker. Not the main lobby, the loading dock, within the hour. I'll unlock the service access remotely when you confirm your approach. Do not call ahead. Do not tell anyone where you're going." A hard silence. "I don't take direction from an auditor." "That's understandable," Piper said, "and when Mr. Solano is upright and in a condition to repeat this instruction himself, you won't have to." Her voice stayed level, almost bored. "Until then, I have full administrative credentials to every Meridian financial account. If you'd prefer to spend the next hour debating organizational hierarchy while Alderton decides what to do with the information he already has, that's your call, but I'd make it quickly." From the toilet seat, Solano let out a low, strained exhale that was almost a laugh. "Do what she says, Gavril. And bring antibiotics. She'll ask for them if you don't." A long beat. 40 minutes, Gavril said. The line went dead. Piper set the phone down. "You knew I'd call him," she said. "I gave you the phone," Solano said. "You could have held it yourself. You would have told me to stop talking and rest." The ghost of that almost smile again. "You would have been right." She handed him 2 ibuprofen from the kit and a glass of water and told him to drink all of it. He did. Gavril arrived at 38 minutes with 2 men and a former military medic named Hatch, who re-examined the stitches with professional attention and told Piper, with visible surprise, that she'd done a reasonable job. She didn't tell him it was the second time in her life she'd had to. The next 5 hours were operational. Alderton had already moved, predictably, but Gavril's team had contingencies and Piper had the financial architecture mapped to 4 degrees of separation. She gave Gavril everything she had on Alderton's routing, including 2 account numbers she was reasonably certain Alderton believed were unknown. They were not. By 8 in the morning, the crisis had a shape. Not resolved. These things never resolved cleanly, she was learning. But contained. Bounded. Something Solano's organization could work around rather than drown in. Solano had slept 4 hours, woken up, and was now sitting at the writing desk in a fresh shirt, color returned, watching her finish the last of the account notifications on the laptop. "You restructured the Cayman routing while I was asleep," he said. "The old structure was compromised," Piper said, without looking up. "I built a new one, 4 layers instead of 3, different settlement windows, no predictable timing patterns." She paused. "You can change the access credentials whenever you want. They're on the notepad." Silence. "You could have used those accounts," Solano said. "The window was open. You had full admin access for 6 hours." Piper looked up. "Yes." "You didn't." "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" She thought about the honest answer, turned it over, decided it was worth saying. "Because stealing from you would have been the expected thing," she said. "And I've spent my whole life doing the unexpected thing. It's the only leverage I've ever actually had." Something shifted in his face. Something that cracked the controlled surface just slightly. An opening, like a window in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. "The door is unlocked," he said. "It has been since Gavril arrived. The service entrance is clear. I'll arrange a car." Piper looked at the door. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked back at the laptop, at the half-finished restructuring of his financial architecture, at the notepad with the new access credentials, at the 6-page memo on the desk that represented the clearest professional thinking she'd done in her entire career. She looked at him. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Me to leave?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then out at the river beyond the glass, catching the early morning light, the city already moving at its usual indifferent pace. "No," he said. The word was quiet and unadorned, and it cost him something to say it. She could tell, "It's not what I want, but what I want and what's fair to you have not historically been the same thing." Piper closed the laptop. She stood up, walked to the door, and put her hand on the knob. She stood there. The hallway beyond was empty and clean, and somewhere below were 42 floors of city, and beyond that a studio apartment she'd barely been in long enough to call it home, and a freelance career that paid the bills but had never, not once in 6 years, made her feel like she was working at the edge of what she could actually do. She thought about the look on Solano's face when she'd handed him the Auditor memo, the slight recalibrations. The moment he'd stopped looking at her as a variable to be managed and started looking at her as something else entirely, something he hadn't accounted for and wasn't sure how to account for and was going to have to, whether he wanted to or not. She pulled the door closed. She locked it from the inside. When she turned around, Solano was watching her from the desk, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on another human being. Raw, and a little stunned, and something that was not quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood. "I'm going to need a real desk," Piper said, walking back across the room. "The writing desk is fine for short-term work, but the chair is terrible after 2 hours, and if I'm restructuring your entire financial architecture, I need something with lumbar support." She picked up the notepad with the account credentials and held it out toward him. "And I want a formal contract, not corporate. Your kind. Mutual terms, written and witnessed." Solano looked at her. "You want a contract with a criminal organization." "I want to know exactly what I'm agreeing to," Piper said. "I've spent my whole life being handed situations with the terms buried in the fine print. I'm done with that." She met his eyes. "I found your leak. I stitched your side in a bathroom at 2 in the morning. I ran your security response and briefed your enforcer and restructured your offshore accounts before you woke up. And I was right about all of it, every single call." She let that sit between them for a moment. "You know what that kind of work is called." Solano stood. He was still moving carefully around the wound, but he stood at his full height and looked at her across the narrow space between the desk and the window. And the exhaustion was still there, but something else had settled in alongside it. Something alert, something that recognized a counterpart when it was standing directly in front of it. "Partner work," he said. "Partner work," Piper agreed. He reached out and took the notepad from her hand. His fingers were warm against hers for a half-second. "The chair is replaceable," he said. "I'll have a proper desk brought up this afternoon. And the contract. And the contract." Piper nodded once. She sat back down, opened the laptop, and found her place in the routing restructure. Outside, Chicago was fully awake, the river catching light, the city running at its usual merciless pace. She had grown up being told she was too stubborn, too sharp-edged, too difficult to place anywhere that mattered. That she asked too many questions and trusted the wrong kind of math, her own. She had been right about the math every single time. The deadbolt she'd just locked from the inside was the first lock she'd ever chosen for herself, and she intended to choose everything that came after it with the same precision.